Hendrik Verwoerd, called by many as the architect of apartheid, one of the most evil systems of oppression, segregation, and subordination of the 20th century. Who was Verwoerd? What was his legacy? And how does it reverberate into the present? Let's find out. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX, where we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. And increasingly on this channel, although we often keep a close eye on current affairs, we're also looking into history, because you can't understand the present without going back into the past. As the philosopher George Santayana once said, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. Now, Hendrik Verwoerd is a name that strikes fear and loathing into the hearts of many people around the world. He has been christened the architect of apartheid, the system of segregation, oppression, and separation, which nearly destroyed South Africa.
The record of stable government will continue in South Africa. Surely it must be a record. 6 prime ministers and only 5 changes of government in 50 years.
Out of which a new democratic South Africa was born, which promised to eradicate the racial subjugation which was created through apartheid, partly which Verwoerd had envisaged. Now, in this episode, I want to tell the story of who Verwoerd actually was, tell his life story, because I'm increasingly realizing the older I get and the more I transition away from being a young person, that the history of apartheid is not being sufficiently understood in South Africa. And that really is preventing our public debate from taking on the depth that it needs to take on. And if we understand the life of Verwoerd, we understand part of what was so evil about the apartheid system. So I'm going to talk about his early life. I'll talk about his rise to political prominence, and then I'll talk about his career in the high offices of government, eventually becoming prime minister from 1958 to 1966. So let's start off with his early life. Verwoerd was actually born in the Netherlands in 1901, and this was just after what's sometimes called the Anglo-Boer War or the South African War had resulted in a defeat for the Afrikaner republics. And his father, watching on from the Netherlands, felt a certain solidarity with the Afrikaner people, obviously because they had come from the Netherlands to South Africa, and actually moved to South Africa. There was this process of people moving to South Africa from the Netherlands in solidarity with the Afrikaner people. And he was one of them. So Verwoerd was actually an immigrant into South Africa. This would be ironic later because he would begin anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant campaigns as he grew in political prominence. But this is often the case. Those who are immigrants become anti-immigrant, and anti-immigration can sometimes lead to even deeper forms of violence and subjugation. But I digress. I'm jumping ahead. Let's get back to his early life. So in 1903, he comes to South Africa as a young boy, and they live in Cape Town, in Wynberg, in Cape Town, for most of his childhood. We don't know very much about it, but we know that he liked sport. Apparently, he was quite an avid cricketer, and grew up within Cape Town, where in fact there were still forms of black franchise at the time. In other words, certain black South Africans were able to vote at the time, and there were other forms of qualified franchise. This would all be stripped away by the apartheid government, which Verwoerd would ultimately lead. Now, interesting things were happening in and around this period. So in 1910, when Verwoerd is around 10 years old, of course, South Africa formally becomes a union. The British and Boer acrimony is patched up, and one united country is effectively built. Now, this country is still tied to England and to the United Kingdom, but it ultimately becomes a union territory. And Verwoerd is watching on as some of the generals that he has idolized have come to this agreement to create one South Africa. And this has a formative impact on him. And soon after that, then, his family actually moves to Rhodesia. Now, his father was a Dutch Reformed minister, and so he ministered both in Cape Town, then in Rhodesia. And Verwoerd moves to Rhodesia with his family. And soon thereafter, after South Africa has become a union, there's the outbreak of the First World War. Verwoerd actually lives through 2 wars, and they have an interesting impact both on South African history, but also on Verwoerd himself. Now, in the First World War, there was a question as to whether South Africa should join and which side. And of course, the decision South Africa ultimately takes affects Verwoerd as well. And part of the unhappiness around the First World War decision, but also this idea that was forming in and around this time of unity between English-speaking and Afrikaans-speaking South Africans. Bear in mind, at this time, black South Africans are an afterthought in South African government. There's still deep segregation. There's still deep subjugation. The Native Land Act is coming up in 1913 to basically push black South Africans off their land into un-arable areas of the country and 13% of the land. But as that process of oppression is happening, there is unity amongst the white South Africans in the country at the time. And Louis Botha, the first Prime Minister of South Africa, is starting to find, along with his protege, Jan Smuts, find his way to a kind of unity government with other sides of the South African political spectrum. And Verwoerd really doesn't like this, and a lot of people don't like this, and this leads to a breakaway and the formation of the National Party in 1914, which Verwoerd later says he always supported until his last day. So he says, from the time I was in my shorts until the moment he was speaking, he had always been an Afrikaner nationalist, and he never quite felt that this idea of unity between the Afrikaner people and the English-speaking white South Africans was a good political idea. He also resisted this idea that South Africa should be tied to the United Kingdom. So we don't know much about his political thought in his early life, but we do have this story about how, because he didn't support the Allied or the British side in the First World War, he was kicked down a flight of stairs by his schoolmaster in Rhodesia, or something to that effect. And it's a reminder of just how violent society was at the time, how violent these schools were at the time. And he remembered that. And I often think that it's experiences like that where villains are created. You know, when Darth Vader starts to get the anger building inside him. I mean, we don't know this from any biographies or anything, but I wonder whether that was a moment where Verwoerd was like, I'm angry and I want to take this out. Anyway, that could be one of the moments where the villain arc begins, and believe me, it's gonna get deeper. So cool, he's this young boy. He's lived in South Africa and Rhodesia. Parents came from the Netherlands. He actually was born there. And he's now getting to the point where he's 17 or 18. It's clear he's a very gifted student. So he ends up coming back. His family then moves to the Free State, and he writes his matric exams, and he actually comes out number 1 in the Free State province and as the 5th best student in South Africa at that time. And he's offered scholarships. I believe he was actually offered a scholarship to go to Oxford, which he declined. He decided to go rather to Germany, and he's clearly a very, very gifted student. So he then comes to Stellenbosch, where he does his further studies. He did his master's at Stellenbosch as well, and he becomes a student leader. And he actually becomes the chairperson of the Stellenbosch SRC, in 1923. So clearly he's a student leader, he's gifted academically, he's in the debating society, and there's this talk that he's a great orator as well. He's really good at speaking, and lots of his teachers and contemporaries talk about how he can hold a crowd with his words. And so that really brings an end to the early life. He also visits Weimar, Germany after that. Not sure whether that's, I think it's just after his postgrad, where he visits Weimar, Germany. And of course, in Germany at this time, although we're in the Weimar Republic and it's a liberal democracy, ostensibly, ideas of anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Semitic sentiment, and also forms of Nazism are slowly beginning to build, but some historians doubt whether this had an influence on Verwoerd, although we do know he was in Germany at that time of the early to mid-20s, where some of these ideas were starting to germinate. That's going to be interesting for an episode later, where he takes a newspaper to court which accuses him of being a Nazi sympathizer, and he actually loses that court case. So that's a synopsis of his early life. Remember, I'm just trying to give you an overview here. I'm not writing a historical textbook as we speak, but I just want to give you a sense, and you can go deeper into the literature and find the exact chronology of the dates and all of that. So that's his life, early life, and he eventually gets his PhD, and this starts a new period in his life as the academic. So Verwoerd then goes on to become a lecturer in psychology. And again, in his early work, in his PhD thesis, there doesn't seem to be a lot of focus on the social aspects of psychology. He's looking at things like the retention of attention and how human personalities are created. But slowly over the period of his academic life, he's being drawn more and more into political questions. It's interesting that he becomes this academic very early on in his life, and he gets his PhD by the age of 25 or something, or 26, and then goes on. And as he's an academic, he starts to become more socially and politically conscious. He gets drawn into his first real political cause, which is this question which is often called the poor white question. It was a major question in South Africa, where the Afrikaner people following the war were in really devastating economic conditions, a lot of them in poverty. And this was obviously a concern for Afrikaners who were becoming industrialists and academics and lawyers and all of that. And it's funny to think today, because that economic project was so successful, that there was a time when there were significant portions of the white South African population who were impoverished. And Verwoerd takes this question up with great zeal, and he forms parts of various committees that are interested in this question. Now, around about this time, there is a coalition government. So this unity government kind of breaks apart, and then the National Party comes to power with the Labour Party in its first stint in power in South Africa. And Verwoerd is obviously watching on, and he's becoming a little bit more engrossed in National Party politics and becoming more and more active. And this is where accusations of him becoming discriminatory in his outlook and starting to think about ideas of how there is this hierarchy of civilization, and particularly in the South African context, Black people should be at the bottom, and that's their natural place, and white Europeans should be at the top. And these ideas are starting to form more in his what's called ethno-psychology. Now, eventually he continues as an academic, and his life before, shall we say, formal politics and media ends with effectively the period just before the start of the Second World War, where he is convinced to leave his post at Stellenbosch and to become the editor of a newly formed newspaper that has the backing of the National Party. In fact, D.F. Malan, the first National Party Prime Minister, the first apartheid prime minister in 1948, actually is one of the shareholders of this Voortrekker Pers, which is the company that owns what would become Die Transvaaler, which is the newspaper that Verwoerd edits for near on a decade. So he leaves Stellenbosch and he's now writing about politics. He's an editor and he's a journalist. And you'll always notice when you look throughout history, a lot of people who are central to politics have also had a history in media, because there's always that link between those who are trying to set the agenda and form opinions and those who are trying to actually govern the country. Alexander Hamilton, for some reason, comes to mind as like a very passionate journalist and then someone who went into the state. But that pattern repeats itself. Even with liberation leaders in the South African context, people often involved in the New Age newspaper or writing for newspapers. Sol Plaatje comes to mind, a liberation leader, but also a journalist. So Verwoerd is a very important journalist. He's now moved, obviously, to the Transvaal, which is now Gauteng, and he's editing, and he becomes both a journalist but also a National Party politician, and is being brought deeper and deeper into National Party structures. Now, we're starting to notice that Verwoerd is very virulent in his belief that black people are inherently inferior, and he's very virulent in his anti-Semitism. So, like I said, Die Transvaaler, when the Second World War starts, is accused of being sympathetic to Hitler's Germany. And even when some of the greater atrocities of that war, but also as Hitler's Germany is starting to annex more and more territory in that war and moving swiftly eastward, Die Transvaaler is seen as a sympathetic publication to Nazi Germany. To the point where one day a South African newspaper, I think it was The Star actually, which still exists, accused Verwoerd of being a Nazi sympathizer because of effectively the way that this publication, of which he was editor, was a tool for Nazi propaganda. Now, Verwoerd took exception to this, and he actually took the newspaper who accused him of being a Nazi sympathizer to court. But he ended up losing that court case, where the judge said that effectively he didn't have enough of a case to sue for libel, and that he had taken certain steps which could amount to aiding the narrative of Nazi Germany. So that was one of the scandals which surrounded him. At the same time, during this moment, the Second World War had really caused a crisis for Afrikaner politics. You had these two leaders, Herzog on the one hand, who was an important Afrikaner nationalist leader, and Smuts on the other hand, who was also an important Afrikaner leader, but who had kind of come together. But when the war broke out, their cabinet was completely split. And those around the Afrikaner nationalist cause believed that South Africa should not have joined the war on the side of Britain, at least in the early stages. And that really caused a crisis in Afrikaner politics. And it would take up until the National Party coming to power in 1948 for those divisions to really settle themselves. Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. So we have effectively Verwoerd leading National Party structures increasingly in the Transvaal, becoming this editor of a newspaper, and becoming deeper and deeper in his discriminatory outlook. Then we come to the third part of this, which is, of course, 1948. Massive election in South Africa in which, to the surprise of many, the National Party comes to power. Afrikaans nationalism has managed to unite around this party, and D.F. Malan becomes the prime minister in 1948. 2 years later, and Verwoerd at this time he becomes a senator within the South African parliament. 2 years later, Verwoerd is promoted to the position of Minister of Native Affairs in 1950. And over the next 16 years, after which he will die, Verwoerd will be one of the most central government figures in not only creating and crafting the policy of apartheid, but instituting it and implementing it in devastating fashion, and in ways that South Africa is still grappling with today. So this is where we really see Verwoerd in all his capacity, but also all of his destructive legacy. So the first thing when he goes and becomes a senator that Verwoerd is able to do is that apartheid, up until that point, had been a campaign slogan. So the National Party went around the country saying, you know what? The way to solve this problem of, there's a black majority in the country, they've largely been pushed to the margins, but, there are all these claims that they should be able to vote and be equal participants in the society. There are two ways we can solve this problem. There's the integrationist way that some white politicians support, which is that we bring them increasingly into society and we give them a qualified vote or something like that. This is something that a person like Helen Suzman, at least in the 1960s, supported. So yes, black people can vote, but only if they're above a certain level of education or a certain level of income. So there was that strand. Then there was a strand which said, you know what, the way to solve this problem is to push black people even further away. We need even more apartness, which is apartheid. And ultra segregation is what we have to do. And that resonated, and that's why the National Party won the election. So, but up until that point, apartheid was a very loose ideology, if not just a slogan, right? Its genesis actually traces to the Dutch Reformed Church, where in the 1920s and 30s, it started thinking of this idea of what happens in church, right? Like, do black people come to church? Do they not? And they devised this idea of segregating religious spaces completely. But then that developed into the segregation of all spaces, and it would be taken to its absolute height in Verwoerd's time, where it graduated into the segregation of territory and even trying to create separate countries within South Africa for black people. But what Verwoerd was really skilled at doing, sadly, was he turned apartheid from this loose ideology into a coherent system. He used his academic training, his writing, and his oratory skills in parliament to say, well, let me tell you what this apartheid thing really is. And in his first speech to parliament, he actually elaborated the system of apartheid. And what he did was he made apartheid seem like it was actually an act of benevolence to black people. So he couched it in the idea that it was actually a developmental path for black people. You'd give them their separate spaces because white people were overlords in his word and were supreme and superior, but give them time to develop in their own spaces, and then we will coexist on some later stage of equality. So you can see that he had in some ways twisted this to suggest that apartheid was actually a good thing for black people, and it was a way of giving them even more rights than they had by increasingly segregating them and then giving them rights within the places that they were segregated into, while they had no rights in the actual country itself. And so part of the reason why people call Verwoerd the architect of apartheid is because he became its chief intellectual spokesperson. And because he dazzled and shocked people with these remarks in his parliamentary speeches as a senator, just 2 years into being a senator, he was made Minister of Native Affairs in 1950. And this was a sprawling portfolio which was really to do with how the central government would manage its segregation project in spheres of education, in spheres of population control, moving people out of big cities, moving people from cities into rural areas, creating these iron walls of segregation, but then also making sure that those people who are segregated out of cities, Black South Africans, and out of white South Africa, were also brought in for their labor. So there was a policy of simultaneous influx control that was elaborated and perfected by Verwoerd, but also of mass migration. And so we had these terrible moments of just the government kicking people off their land and forcing them into these new, what were eventually to become thought of as homelands, or as they would be mockingly called, Bantustans. So Verwoerd was central right when the apartheid government in 1948 came to power. 2 years later, he was in the central portfolio that was dealing with exactly how this government interfaced with the black majority. And you'll realize that at this time, as apartheid really kicked into gear, and people suddenly realized, oh my goodness, like this system is serious and this government is implementing it with every bit of its might. That's when the liberation movement started to also kick into a new gear. And in the 1950s, you had a new set of ANC leaders like Mandela, Tambo, Sisulu, who said, look, all these petitions and stuff are well and good, but we need to get way more serious about how we fight the system, because it's clear this government has a bigger and a larger and a more scary plan. And that's why you got things like the Defiance campaign, and eventually in the decades to follow, the formation of Umkhonto weSizwe itself, because apartheid was moving so fast, in some ways under the stewardship of Malan and Verwoerd, that the old methods were just deemed completely futile against what the state was doing to black South Africans. You had the system of passes and pass books, and Verwoerd did a huge amount to upgrade and take this system forward to the extent where now everyone had to have this book. And as you know, the history of the pass system, which dates back long before Verwoerd, but his actions in instituting that system more carefully, really led to these kind of anti-pass protests, which we saw. And this takes us to a next very important moment in Verwoerd's tenure and his life, which is, of course, he then becomes prime minister. So we have the Malan government is done. There was a Strydom government, and then Verwoerd comes in. And in 1958, at the time, there were 3 candidates vying for it, and Verwoerd ultimately wins the vote, and he becomes prime minister. And he will be prime minister up until 1966, when he is assassinated, and we'll talk a bit about that as well. But from the moment he becomes prime minister, you can imagine that the struggle against apartheid, kicks into a new moment of fear and worry, because the Native Affairs Minister is now in charge of the entire government. And as I say, to take it back to the pass system, protests against the pass system then become the rallying point for the liberation movement. Now, Mandela is increasingly protesting against the pass system, but at this point we have the Pan-Africanist Congress, late 50s, early 60s, which is a breakaway from the ANC, which is saying even the ANC is not doing enough. We need to be more militant and more radical in our struggle against the segregation and oppression. Bear in mind that in addition to the influx control and the population movements and the hierarchy and the racial oppression and the segregation, there is also a move to completely stratify education and only give a certain lower form of education to black people, who are seen as only being able to occupy a certain intellectual station. And Verwoerd is central as well to that. So every dimension of South African life is stratified and made into a hierarchy where black people are at the bottom and white people are at the top. So now we come to 1960, and this is a pivotal moment in Verwoerd's tenure as prime minister. The anti-pass protests are growing, and eventually Sharpeville and Langa occur. peaceful protests where people are handing in their passes and saying, arrest us, we no longer want to use these pass books, which are a symbol of our segregation and oppression, and end up flooding police stations. Eventually, the South African police at the time unload violent fire, shooting many people in the back as they flee, and it becomes an international outrage that peaceful protesters are really being mowed down and effectively massacred. And Verwoerd, from that moment on, is seen as a figure, because of course there's no jot of an apology, and actually the whole thing is turned on the protesters, and they are demonized, etc. Verwoerd then starts to become seen as not only a figure who has instituted the system, but a person who is not prepared to flinch at the use of violence against those who peacefully protest against the system. And part of that is what eventually turns the liberation movement to the decision to engage in violent resistance against the apartheid state, and that's why Umkhonto weSizwe is formed within this decade, and Phoqo and other formations, which is the PAC's wing. So now the PAC is catapulted to the forefront. The ANC is also under pressure to get more militant, and there are increasing attempts to ban and subjugate and use the law to really stamp down on dissent. And so we have a series of important trials. People are charged with treason merely for trying to resist this. Being a member of the ANC becomes banned. And we have all that awful history in South Africa where resistance is completely cracked down on. Verwoerd is central to this as the Prime Minister, both guiding native affairs, but also the security infrastructure of the South African state. Now, if that wasn't enough, Verwoerd is developing this deeper idea of what he calls separate development. And that is that segregation isn't enough. What we really need is we need these kind of separate quasi-states within the South African state for black people. So we're going to create all these different little territories around South Africa that will be dotted inside South Africa, where black people will actually live, and they will be kind of in a state, but in a state that isn't recognized by other states, and they will have the right to vote in those states, but they will not have the right, obviously, any rights within white South Africa. So rather than just segregating society, that was then turned into a deeper form of segregation where you would have homelands, which were these places based on what Verwoerd and the apartheid architects thought were these traditional territories where black people deserved to be. So if you were Xhosa, you would live in the Transkei and the Ciskei homelands, etc. So there were these kind of ethnic enclaves where black people would first be divided into their different ethnicities, and then they would only be able to live and have rights in these quasi-unrecognized states. And this was a massively expensive project, but one which was ultimately destined to completely remake South Africa, because the only place, therefore, that black people would have rights was in these enclaves that the apartheid government had effectively designed for them. And of course, they tried to build these kind of puppet regimes within these little enclaves which owed their loyalty to the apartheid government, and kind of give them as much autonomy as was useful to try and create a certain legitimacy. But most people saw through this, and as we move towards the 70s, as after Verwoerd's death, but as this program was really reaching fever pitch, people like Steve Biko, this is how they arrived and made very important interventions, saying that these homelands are merely Bantustans, right? They're places where you send black people to become occupants of fake states so that they can't have a real country of their own where they actually live and where everyone can live together in equality. So Verwoerd's dream of separate development was a way around this problem of, where do we put the black South Africans who want equal rights in South Africa? Well, instead of giving them equal rights in one country, we're going to give them 13 different countries that are not really countries. and they can only have rights there. And of course, this is also built on the earlier history of land dispossession. So these countries were based in all these weird pockets that just happened not to be arable, and it was only 13% of the land. Meanwhile, black South Africans made up the overwhelming majority of the population. It was an evil scheme to push the majority into the minority of land and subjugate them there and deprive them of the rights that they had been calling for many generations. Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel, so why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. Verwoerd also made South Africa a republic, so he took away South Africa's links to Britain. There was a whole furor over withdrawing from the Commonwealth, and there was increasing pressure even from Britain, hardly at that time necessarily a bastion for racial equality, to say, South Africa, you're going too far. Other African countries are decolonizing and you are recolonizing. This can't continue. And Verwoerd took great umbrage at this. And Harold Macmillan, the UK Prime Minister who visited South Africa at the time, made a speech saying that the winds of change were blowing through South Africa, and Verwoerd really didn't like this and responded to him and said, you don't know what you're talking about. So really, when we take a step back before we get to the assassination, and maybe we should do a further video on that because it's a deeper topic. Verwoerd was an intellectual generator and consolidator of apartheid, but also an administrator of apartheid, and finally the prime minister of the apartheid state at a time when it took its segregationist ideology to the ultimate extreme and also began to become a far more repressive state towards black people who were criminalized and jailed and beaten and shot for mostly non-violent resistance towards apartheid in this era. One day in the Chamber of Parliament in 1966, a parliamentary messenger walked up to Verwoerd. Apparently at the time he thought he was coming to greet him or something, and assassinated him right in the parliamentary chamber. And Verwoerd died on that day. He'd actually survived an assassination attempt 6 years earlier after the Sharpeville massacre. Now, the assassin was Dimitri Tsafendas. Tsafendas was of a mixed race heritage. I believe he had a Mozambican parent and a South African parent. Now, Tsafendas was framed immediately after that as not having had a political motive. He was framed as someone who was who was of unsound mind and had lost his mind. There's actually a clip of Tsafendas. He's also now died, but there's a clip of him in prison where he speaks about him murdering Verwoerd because he believed he was an immoral man. Let's have a look at that here.
Because Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd was an immoral man, I decided to stab him, and I killed him.
Now, there have been some recent historical reappraisals of Tsafendas, and some suggest there's a book. I must try and find the name of the author here for you. The Man Who Killed Apartheid, The Life of Dimitri Tsafendas, and that is by Harris Dozemetsis. So there have been some appraisals where the idea is that Tsafendas knew exactly what he was doing and that there was a deeper political motive behind the assassination. The apartheid government, of course, did everything in its power to dispute that and just say that this was the act of a person who was not in control of their faculties or their mind. So that ended the life of Verwoerd. It did not end apartheid. he was quoted once as saying that the idea was to implant apartheid so deeply into South African society that no future government would be able to undo it. And some say that that has at least been a partial success when we look at the segregation we still have in South African society, townships, rural areas, and despite all the work that's been done in 30 years to try and deliver South Africa from this segregationist past, so much of that legacy still lives on in the South African economy, in the spatial configuration of South Africa. But although it would take many years and about 3 decades since the death of Verwoerd to institute a new constitution, South Africa ultimately did become a multiracial democracy with one person, one vote, and where all people were considered equal under the law. So at least to the extent of that, there was ultimately a repudiation of everything that Verwoerd stood for. Now, to end off, and maybe we can do a biography of his successor, Forster, who was, I mean, yeah, like maybe even worse in terms of evil. But the reason I do this episode is to say that we cannot just ignore the history of where South Africa comes from. Of course, apartheid was 30 years ago, and Verwoerd's life is even more than that, 60 years ago, some of the things he did. And although there have been many failures of the democratic project, we often underestimate the extent to which the apartheid project was implemented and how deep that project really went into people's psychology, into the country's spatial makeup, into its economy, and even into its institutions and its politics. So when we wonder why we have these developmental challenges, yes, some of them are to do with terrible corruption. Some of them are to do with maladministration. But we have a broken structure in our society, which was broken over many decades and generations. And it's going to take a very long time for us to come out of that brokenness and to create a society where every person has equal opportunity no matter what their racial background. And so it's always important to go back into history and remember where we come from. So that is a brief biography of Hendrik Verwoerd. I've noticed on YouTube there isn't a lot of biographical material on him, and I hope this has given you some food for thought. As I say, let's deepen these conversations. Are just, this is not necessarily what I do in my spare time, but I look and I read around, and then I give you some thoughts, and I ask you in the comments to come back. It's not necessarily an academic paper on Hendrik Verwoerd, which I could write if I wanted to, but no, it's just an attempt to give you the basic foundations and start a conversation and a debate. So what are your thoughts? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Is there any nuance you'd like to add on the life of Verwoerd? Feel free to drop any corrections as well in the comments below. And let's have a conversation about this life, what it means, what it has ultimately created, and whether its legacy lives on or has been destroyed in South Africa yet. Thanks a lot for joining SMWX. Help us get to 150,000 subscribers. Class is closed. Aye.